Right now, picture a Roman soldier at a campfire tearing into a roasted leg of meat. That is the image every movie sold you. Spears, capes, a spit turning over the flames. It is almost entirely wrong. The real legionary's dinner was a bowl of gray porridge. He ground the grain himself, that same afternoon, with a stone he carried on his own back. He did this every night for 25 years, and the reason he did it that way is not a small detail about ancient cooking. It is the reason Rome conquered most of the known world. Here is the number that starts everything: 1 kilogram of grain. That was the daily ration for a single Roman soldier, unground, carried on his own shoulders. Multiply that by a legion, 5,000 men. You need 20 to 30 tons of food arriving every single day just to keep them alive. Multiply it again. At its height, Rome kept somewhere between 300,000 and 450,000 men under arms, spread across 3 continents at once. That is not an army. That is a mobile city. And a mobile city has to eat every single day. Win or lose, harvest or no harvest. Most ancient armies solved this by stealing. They marched into enemy land and took whatever the fields had that season. Rome mostly did not. Rome built something else instead. A system so unglamorous that most histories barely mention it, next to the battles. What that system fed the men who carried it is the real story. It explains the empire better than any single victory does. Start with the tent. 8 men shared one, called a contubernium. 2 mule handlers came with it, not soldiers themselves but still fed from the same stores. Between them they carried a single hand mill, a rough stone disc called a quern. Every evening, whoever's turn it was sat down at the quern. He ground the day's grain to flour kernel by hand. It was slow. It was exhausting after a full day's march. There was no way around it. That flour became one of 2 things: bread, baked in a clay oven if the camp had time to build one, or poles, a thick wheat porridge, boiled with salt, fat, and whatever oil or milk was on hand. Poles was not punishment. Poles was Tuesday. It was what a Roman soldier ate most nights of his career. A wall in Britain, a riverbank in Syria, it made no difference. But there was a version of that grain ration that really was punishment. It is one of the strangest details in the whole system. Wheat was food for people. Barley was food for horses and mules. The historian Polybius records the punishment for failure in duty. Fall asleep on watch, break ranks, and you could be sentenced to draw barley instead of wheat. Not less food, the same amount. Just the animal's grain instead of the man's. Every soldier in the unit could see exactly whose ration had changed. You did not need a whip for that kind of shame. You needed a different sack. Then there was what they drank. Clean water on campaign was rare and often dangerous. So the army issued something called posca, cheap wine gone sour, cut with water. It was sharp enough to disguise the taste of whatever the water actually was. It killed some of the bacteria in it too, though no soldier would have put it that way. Posca was so ordinary, so much the drink of common soldiers and the poor, that it turns up in an unlikely place. When a dying man on a cross asked for something to drink, on a hill outside Jerusalem, a Roman soldier answered. On a sponge held up on a stick was posca. The cheapest drink in the empire. Ended up in the most famous death scene in history. For a long time that grim picture was the whole story historians had: grain, punishment, sour wine. Then, at a fort called Vindolanda, on the edge of Roman Britain, archaeologists found something nobody expected. Thin wooden tablets, thrown out as rubbish nearly 2,000 years ago, preserved in mud that never dried out. Written in ink in a soldier's own hand were shopping lists. 46 different foods named one by one: bacon, ham, venison, chicken, oysters, 100 miles from the nearest coast, honey, spelt, and barley beer. Even a jar of garum showed up, the fermented fish sauce that flavored food across the entire empire. Shipped all the way to a muddy fort near the edge of the known world. Some of the richest items, the venison, the imported wine, the spices, belonged to the commander's household rather than the ordinary ranks. But the ordinary soldiers were not living on gray porridge alone either. They were eating better than almost anyone assumed. On a frontier Rome had conquered less than a lifetime earlier. The tablets are not the only proof. Dig through the rubbish pits of frontier forts across Britain and Germany. The animal bones there tell the same story from a different angle. Zooarchaeologists sorting those bones found something striking. Beef made up somewhere between 45 and 65% of the meat eaten at most military sites, cut marks and all. Not scraps. Regular butchery, on a scale that meant regular supply. And the mix was not identical everywhere. German forts leaned on pork. British forts, especially the smaller auxiliary posts, leaned on mutton. 2 garrisons of the same empire, eating 2 different diets, both shaped by whatever animals the land around them actually raised. None of that food grew at Vindolanda itself though. Britain was cold, wet, and had been Roman for barely a generation. Every jar of fish sauce, every amphora of wine had crossed the empire to get there. That is the part that actually matters. Rome built a machine for this. It was called the Annona Militaris, a tax paid not in coin but in grain, meat, and oil. It was collected from farmers across the provinces and funneled toward whatever army needed it that season. A single cargo ship could carry 150 tons across the Mediterranean, enough to feed a legion for weeks. On land, that same legion dragged a baggage train behind it, 600 to 1,000 mules and wagons stretching for miles. It carried nothing but food, fodder, and the tools to cook it. This was bureaucracy as a weapon. Clerks, tax collectors, ship captains, and mule drivers, none of them holding a sword. All of them were as essential to conquest as the legionaries. That machine is what let Rome fight wars no one else could. An enemy army lived off whatever land it stood on. When the local harvest ran out, or the season turned to winter, that army went home. It had no other way to eat. A Roman army did not have to. Its food followed it, ship by ship, wagon by wagon, regardless of what grew nearby. Rome could besiege a city for a year. Rome could winter its legions in a swamp on the German frontier and still have bread waiting in the morning. The empire did not simply outfight its enemies, it outlasted them, because it had solved the one problem every ancient army eventually lost to: hunger. But build a machine that precise, and it can also break precisely. When the grain fleets ran late, when a province revolted and stopped paying its tax in wheat, when a corrupt officer sold off the rations meant for his own men, the result was not quiet suffering, it was mutiny. Roman soldiers tolerated brutal discipline, terrible weather, and enemies on every border. What they would not tolerate, again and again across the empire's history, was an empty grain store. Entire legions rose up not over politics, not over a hated general. The wagons carrying their bread had simply stopped arriving. The same system that let Rome conquer 3 continents could turn its own soldiers against it within days. It happened the moment the flour stopped moving. An empire that ran on bread could also starve on it. So the next time you picture a Roman soldier, put down the roasted meat and the wine goblet. Picture him instead at the end of a 15-mile march, sitting on the ground grinding his own grain by hand, because if he did not do it, nobody in his tent would eat that night. Picture the shame of being handed a sack of barley in front of his tent mates. Picture 150 tons of grain crossing the Mediterranean on a single ship. Also, a fort in the mud of northern Britain could still have oysters. None of it looks like conquest. It looks like logistics, like a supply list, like a chore a man was sick of after year 1. But that chore, repeated by hundreds of thousands of men across 3 continents for centuries, without ever quite running out, it was what conquest actually was. Rome did not win with the sword first. It won because it never stopped feeding the hand that held it. Next time you eat something without thinking about where it came from, remember this. For the man who helped build an empire, that same bowl was the whole plan.